For decades, the Duke of Kent kept a sealed velvet envelope locked in his private estate, refusing even the most powerful hands in the palace access. But now, without warning or explanation, he has released its contents to the world. What lay inside has not only stunned the monarchy, but reshaped everything we thought we knew about Queen Elizabeth II's secret legacy, and Catherine's rise was no accident. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The envelope, stitched with a discreet gold insignia long believed to reference the Queen's private vault, had remained untouched since the year of her passing. Within it were a series of glossy, aged photographs wrapped in silk and bound with a black ribbon, each frame more bewildering than the last. There, in unfiltered candor, stood Queen Elizabeth, not as the stoic figurehead the world recognized, but as a woman gently leaning in toward a young Catherine, her hand on her arm, her expression deliberate, intense. The location was unfamiliar, but insiders confirmed it to be part of the royal chambers beneath St. George's Tower, rarely accessed and never photographed. The revelation was seismic. These were not public appearances nor ceremonial engagements. These were private, strategic, and deeply symbolic moments. Catherine wasn't just visiting the Queen, she was being mentored. And suddenly, everything the palace had claimed about Catherine's integration into the royal family began to collapse under the weight of this new truth. Speculation exploded across royal circles. Why had the Duke waited until now? Why release these images when the monarchy was already bracing under pressure from succession debates and ailing health at the very top? Theories pointed to growing tensions within the family, particularly over Camilla's increasing marginalization and William's rumored frustration with outdated protocols. This leak wasn't clumsy, it was calculated. It was a message, and not just to the press. According to palace sources, an emergency meeting was convened the same evening the photos surfaced. William was said to have stared at the images for over 15 minutes before speaking, his face pale. She knew, he reportedly whispered. She knew exactly what she was doing. Attempts by Clarence House to suppress the leak failed almost immediately. Within hours, foreign media outlets in Belgium and Canada had secured digital copies, with one French publication suggesting the envelope was originally labelled PCC, possibly short for Personal Continuity Codex, a rumoured but never confirmed private document outlining the Queen's emergency succession intentions. The term resurfaced with alarming frequency as journalists and former aides scrambled to connect decades-old whispers to this sudden, very public proof. In retrospect, the signs had always been there: fleeting glances, unspoken gestures, subtle deviations from protocol where Catherine stood just a little closer, held documents just a little longer. But no one had anticipated such concrete evidence. These weren't speculative tabloids or misinterpreted sound bites. These were photographs, intentional, framed, and now irreversible. But while the photographs sent shockwaves through the family, it was the quiet expressions between Elizabeth and Catherine in those captured moments that whispered a far deeper revelation. Hidden in the labyrinth of Windsor Castle were rooms never meant for public record. Yet it was there that the Queen began preparing Catherine for something no one else knew. These weren't polite teas or ceremonial talks. They were strategic sessions, filled with purpose, foresight, and warning. For the first time, we peel back the velvet curtain on the silent pact between monarch and future Queen. It began quietly, deliberately so, during a period when William was posted abroad for diplomatic training in the Middle East. Catherine was often seen attending to her duties, publicly mild in presence, but privately summoned to areas of Windsor no press or palace biographer had access to. These late afternoon gatherings weren't listed in royal diaries or official engagements. They occurred at the Queen's discretion under absolute silence, and with the same precision once used to prepare sovereigns for war. A former senior valet would later describe Elizabeth's tone during these meetings as urgently protective, as if she knew she had limited time to forge a successor capable of navigating storms yet unseen. That tone, he added, reminded him of the Queen's address during the Suez Crisis, measured, yet laced with iron beneath. What exactly was being said behind those sealed walls? Now, with the photographs unveiled, we have some idea. Catherine, it appears, was being tutored not in pageantry, but in permanence. Discussions reportedly included ancient codes of succession not found in public law, but referenced only in Appendix Windsor, a set of principles dating back to the Restoration. Legal charters marked Seal 4, Eyes only, were allegedly reviewed together, covering contingencies ranging from royal incapacitation to public revolt. At the heart of it was one unwavering theme: stabilization of the monarchy in a time of rapid decline. Catherine wasn't simply being briefed, she was being readied. Elizabeth understood the tides were turning, and while tradition would have her son Charles take the throne, the Queen knew legacy wasn't passed through blood alone. It was passed through conviction. Even more mysterious was the existence of what staff referred to as the Grey Passage, a narrow windowless corridor linking Elizabeth's private study with a lower-level secure vault. Only 3 people were said to have known about it in the past 40 years: Elizabeth herself, the Duke of Edinburgh, and her personal archivist. But according to Palace Whispers, Catherine was granted access in 2016. The Alt, as it turns out, wasn't just for storage. It contained crisis blueprints, private correspondences with global leaders, and dossiers, many handwritten by Elizabeth, outlining the psychological profiles of senior figures within and outside the family. Catherine was reportedly asked to memorize certain sections and commit critical strategies to heart, without ever recording them. The Queen understood the importance of what could never be hacked, subpoenaed, or leaked: memory. As part of her mentoring, Elizabeth also guided Catherine through the subtle art of reading diplomatic body language. This wasn't about charm or poise, it was about dominance disguised as grace. The Queen herself had survived Churchill, Thatcher, and Blair not just through stoicism, but through silence that screamed when necessary. Catherine, often mistaken for delicate, was being sharpened to inherit that very skill. Their relationship, it turns out, was not built on affection, but on selection. Elizabeth had chosen her not as a daughter-in-law, but as a contingency, a living vault, a vessel for continuity if the House of Windsor ever fractured. But one particular image from the collection, Elizabeth placing her hand on Catherine's shoulder beneath a portrait of Queen Victoria, ignited questions the palace could not answer. In the folds of royal tradition, one rule has stood the test of centuries: the Victoria Protocol, a hidden doctrine meant for a monarch's eyes only. But according to insiders, Elizabeth chose to break this ancient vow for Catherine. Why would a sovereign breach sacred boundaries unless she believed the throne's future could only survive through a single woman? For generations, the Victoria Protocol existed as a whispered myth among royal aides, its true nature buried beneath layers of ceremonial distraction and constitutional ambiguity. Said to have been drafted in 1899 by Queen Victoria herself, the protocol reportedly outlined a covert process for emergency succession in the event of mass upheaval, abdication, or internal collapse. Its pages were said to contain not only alternative lines of continuation, but also spiritual guidelines: Queen Victoria's moral vision for the future of the monarchy, passed not through bloodlines but through character. Until now, no monarch had publicly acknowledged its existence. But the photographs released by the Duke of Kent showed something deeply unsettling. In at least 3 images, Catherine is seen holding a black, leather-bound journal with gilded corners identical, historians argue, to the last known sketches of the Victoria Protocol's vault casing. That alone would be controversial. But then came the account of the nocturnal reading. A former senior chambermaid who served Windsor during Elizabeth's final decade claims that one night near the winter solstice, Catherine was summoned after midnight. The Queen had reportedly requested the fireplaces in the North Library be lit despite no scheduled events. Catherine entered the chamber quietly, was seen leaving nearly 2 hours later. And it was that night, the maid insists, when Elizabeth read the protocol aloud in full. It was a breach of sacred continuity unprecedented. The Queen's private secretary is said to have objected, reminding Her Majesty that the document was not to be spoken outside a sovereign's reign, but Elizabeth overruled him. Her reason? Because the realm will not hold without her. What could possibly drive the Queen to invoke such an ancient, controversial power? One phrase, reportedly repeated several times in the reading, might hold the answer: the second eclipse. The term appears in footnotes linked to the early 20th century drafts of the protocol and is believed to refer to a period in which the Crown's public legitimacy enters rapid decay following the death of a highly respected monarch. Elizabeth, ever the realist, saw the cracks long before they widened. And she believed Catherine, not Camilla, not even Charles, possessed the spiritual weight, the cultural timing, and the emotional intelligence to stabilize what would come next. This revelation has ignited fierce speculation within palace circles. The fact that Catherine was trusted with the protocol, even shown holding it, suggests she was formally chosen not in whispered preference, but in sovereign act. Long before the Queen's final illness, decisions were being made in silence. Decisions that bypassed tradition, outpaced Parliament, and ignored the line of succession altogether. The monarchy's continuity, in Elizabeth's eyes, would not be protected by titles, but by resolve. And Catherine had it. Yet while Catherine absorbed the burden of a future still unspoken, Camilla, already established beside Charles, had no idea the tide was shifting beneath her. While Camilla ascended publicly beside Charles, another narrative was unfolding quietly, one where she was being bypassed by the Queen herself. The photographs reveal something devastating. Catherine, not Camilla, was the one being granted access, training, and symbolic gestures that scream of succession. Had Elizabeth orchestrated an emotional coup from within her own court? For more than a year and a half, Camilla remained entirely in the dark. As she fulfilled her public duties with Charles, smiling beside him at foreign visits and waving from palace balconies, she was reportedly unaware that just corridors away, Catherine was being ushered into the very inner sanctum Camilla believed belonged to her. Confidential sources now confirm that from early 2020 through the final months of Elizabeth's reign, Camilla was neither informed of nor invited to the weekly Windsor mentorships. In hindsight, her absence from critical briefings wasn't an oversight, it was intentional. Catherine, described as a calming force with iron beneath, had become the Queen's quiet project, while Camilla's role was silently capped, a ceiling carefully installed by Elizabeth herself. Among the Duke of Kent's revelations, one photograph stands out: Catherine, standing alone in the Royal Vestments Gallery, reviewing a collection of ceremonial regalia historically reserved for reigning monarchs, not consorts, not spouses, monarchs. The robe she held, the orb beside her, the unguarded confidence in her posture. It wasn't theatrical, it was transitional. It was as if the crown was being introduced to its next bearer, without a coronation. This moment alone would be enough to spark debate, but it was followed by confirmation that Camilla had been denied access to 3 key state briefings that Catherine was cleared to attend. The Queen had made her division unmistakable. One was to stand with Charles, the other was to stand alone. An aide who served both women described a particularly tense encounter. Camilla, entering an unscheduled meeting in the Queen's study, reportedly froze upon seeing Catherine seated beside Elizabeth holding the monarch's private signet ring. There was no explanation, no warning, no apology. Just a quiet pause as Catherine looked up, unfazed, and Elizabeth continued speaking without acknowledgement of Camilla's entrance. That moment, the aide said, broke something in Camilla. From that day, her demeanour shifted, her tone hardened, and her appearances beside Charles became colder, more rehearsed. The strain only intensified following Elizabeth's jubilee, while Camilla expected symbolic validation, perhaps even her own moment of visual triumph. It was Catherine who was seen occupying the lion's seat, a historical marker of future authority placed beside the sovereign only once per generation. Camilla, seated further behind, masked her dismay with stoic composure, but the press noticed the arrangement immediately. It was subtle. But in the royal world, subtlety is declaration, and behind it, the Queen's message rang louder than ceremony. The monarchy must survive beyond titles, and Catherine was its shield. Further confirmation came in the form of the Duke of Kent's personal notes accompanying the released documents. Elizabeth, he wrote, admired Camilla's loyalty, but doubted her constitutional resolve should the monarchy enter another cultural storm. In those exact words, she separated personal compatibility from institutional necessity, and that, above all, was her guiding principle. Elizabeth had lived through wars, divorces, abdications, and media implosions. She understood that survival required more than appearances, it required foresight, and foresight had chosen Catherine. But the emotional heart of this unravelling lies in a single never-before-seen photograph taken not at a ceremony, but in the Queen's private greenhouse. No throne, no jewels, no protocol. Just Elizabeth surrounded by blooming orchids, extending a rare smile to Catherine, who held a notepad marked for the realm. This image, experts say, holds more symbolic weight than any coronation, and its emotional undertone may carry the most shocking implication. Yet, this was Elizabeth's quiet farewell and her private endorsement. The photograph arrived last in the envelope, separate from the others, slipped inside a smaller ivory folder with no caption, no date, no royal seal. It was unlike anything the public had ever seen. The Queen was not seated in her formal attire, nor was she surrounded by guards or regal furniture. She was casual, grounded, disarmed of all the trappings that defined her reign. Her attention, for once, wasn't on the realm, but on the woman she had chosen to preserve it. At her feet, Catherine sat on a small wooden stool, legs crossed, notebook in hand, listening. No instructions seemed to be given aloud, and yet everything essential was being said. This wasn't a moment for the cameras. It was a moment for history. Sources have now confirmed what was once mere speculation. The image was captured not by a palace photographer, but by the Duke of Kent himself at Elizabeth's direct request. The timing, the setup, even the angle, it was all intentional. And it was taken in a location never used for official royal documentation, the Queen's private greenhouse. This was a space Elizabeth fiercely protected. According to staff, it was reserved for only the most intimate of matters, those touching the crown, the family, and the soul of the nation. The choice of location itself spoke volumes. But it was the flowers behind them that sent analysts spiraling. Nestled in a vase to the left of Elizabeth's chair was an orchid, a rare species known historically to bloom only near death, a detail that would not have escaped the Queen's own symbolic discipline. It had been used at royal funerals before, including the one for her father. Placing it in this photo was not accidental, it was a farewell. The position of the two women, as several military historians have pointed out, mirrors the iconic wartime image of Winston Churchill and Lord Mountbatten in mid-briefing during the darkest days of World War II. In both cases, one figure passes silent authority to the other, not with commands, but with presence. The symmetry is chilling, and it deepens when you consider what Catherine held in her hand, a notepad, partially visible, scrawled in what appears to be her handwriting. One page stands out. On it, 5 words, "Clarion begins with truth." That phrase "Clarion" has surfaced before, in coded briefings and whispered royal protocol theory, but never publicly, never confirmed. Its sudden emergence now has constitutional theorists racing to unpack what Elizabeth may have been building behind the scenes. There is growing belief that this meeting was not only the Queen's final teaching, but her final act as sovereign architect. In a moment stripped of all pretense, Elizabeth handed over the last unspoken elements of her reign not to Charles, not to Parliament, but to Catherine. A trust built over years, forged in secrecy, culminating in one haunting image that says everything without uttering a word. Her informal attire, the smile that never met the public, the shared stillness all speak to a transfer that went far beyond succession. It was legacy, and it was love, shaped through duty. And while the world stared at these still images in awe, few noticed what the Duke had placed in the corner of his announcement. A seal bearing the initials Appendix Windsor 4. Behind every monarch is a contingency, but behind Elizabeth, it seems, was an entire, emergency succession infrastructure the world never knew existed. Appendix Windsor 4, a name that now sends shivers down the spine of royal officials, and at its centre, Catherine, chosen not as an accessory but as the last strategic pillar of the Queen's final legacy. The seal first appeared as a faint watermark on the bottom right of the greenhouse photograph release Appendix Windsor 4. It was subtle enough to escape casual scrutiny, but to those who knew what to look for, it was thunderous. Appendix Windsor 4 has long been speculated by former aides, historians, and intelligence insiders as the most classified document in the monarchy's modern structure. Allegedly conceived in the late 1960s during the peak of the Cold War, it was designed as an invisible parachute deployable only in the event of national instability, royal collapse, or total loss of public trust. It had never been confirmed, never discussed in official circles, until now, and what the documents revealed was far more than a theoretical safety net. It was a blueprint for survival, and Catherine had been etched into its core. Following Brexit and the cultural turbulence that followed, insiders claim Queen Elizabeth personally revised the document on at least 3 separate occasions. Then, during the height of the pandemic, a final revision was handwritten, its most striking feature, a direct mention of Catherine by her first name alone. Catherine, not Duchess of Cambridge, not Princess of Wales, but Catherine. That informal intimacy, unprecedented in a constitutional draft of such scale, was interpreted by those familiar with protocol as more than favoritism. It was designation, it signaled trust of the deepest institutional kind, reserved not for those next in line, but for those next in purpose. The appendix outlined what has now been dubbed Royal Stabilizer Protocols, a cascading set of power redistributions designed to be activated if the monarch's rule became impaired, unpopular, or ethically compromised. These protocols, according to portions leaked from the Duke of Kent's archive, granted Catherine provisional access to sensitive national archives, pre-approved communication channels with select foreign sovereigns, and silent authority to convene Council Clarion, a strategic committee with only 5 known members and no official record. It wasn't a handover of the crown, it was a shielding of the institution itself, and Elizabeth, in all her foresight, had chosen the one person she believed could protect the monarchy without seeking to possess it. What makes this revelation even more explosive is the palace's current stance. As public and media pressure builds, no acknowledgement of Appendix Windsor 4 has been issued, no denials, no confirmations, just silence. And yet, the evidence continues to stack. Analysts now believe several of Catherine's appearances over the last 2 years, including her quiet presence at a diplomatic dinner with 2 Scandinavian monarchs, were not symbolic gestures but test runs of Appendix 4's enactment. This wasn't tradition, it was strategy pure and deliberate, a contingency layered in codes, protocol, and private instruction, and Catherine, handpicked not just as consort but as custodian of a vanishing monarchy, had shouldered it without public knowledge or recognition. The monarchy had bet on her not for pomp but for preservation. But while legal experts debate the implications, it's a letter tucked into a side pocket of the envelope that has turned everything personal, especially for William. Among photographs and official documents was a single folded letter, handwritten and signed Elizabeth R. It was addressed not to Charles, not to Anne, but to Catherine. William reportedly found it before palace archivists could intervene. What he read, insiders claim, broke him. This wasn't royal instruction. This was a mother's final wish never meant for her grandson to read. The discovery came late, long after the official material from the velvet envelope had been catalogued. William, gripped by suspicion and solitude, returned alone to the archive room in the early hours, insisting on one last review before external authorities were brought in. It was then, while rifling through an inner flap of the envelope's lining, that his fingers grazed the edge of a thin piece of parchment folded 3 times, its outer edge faintly embossed with a familiar symbol. What followed, aides say, was silence. No outburst, no demand. Just the slow, unravelling of words that were never meant to be seen by him, words that weren't policy or planning, but the aching voice of a grandmother whose greatest secret was not about power, but about faith. The letter began with warmth, but wasted no time in gravity. To my Catherine, it opened, a phrase that, in its intimacy, already marked the contents as deeply personal. It spoke of the trials to come not in names or dates, but in shapes. Elizabeth described a coming season of confusion, of shifting ground, and faltering public trust. She acknowledged Charles's temperament, his need for reflection, and Camilla's unsteady optics, a term that would later ignite fury within Clarence House. But her focus never strayed far from Catherine. Again and again, she returned to the same belief, that Catherine alone could preserve the soul of the monarchy not through title, but through quiet resilience. Lines from the letter, leaked by a horrified staffer weeks later, painted a bond that had existed entirely out of sight. Elizabeth wrote of their private sessions, their shared glances in public, their understanding without words. She referenced small jokes, one about Catherine's first Windsor walk, another about a misplaced handbag that showed not only trust, but affection. This wasn't mentorship alone. It was legacy passed with love, and it was sealed with one final line that has since echoed across every chamber of power in Britain: make her queen in all but name, if they cannot do the rest. According to two aides who spoke under strict anonymity, William sat frozen with the letter in his hand for nearly half an hour. When he finally moved, it was only to photocopy the contents before locking the original away. The copy he burned, not out of anger but because he could not bear the weight of others interpreting his grandmother's intent. And yet, in burning it, he ensured that only his memory now held the truth, and with it, the burden. For 3 days, William withdrew from all public engagements. His absence was explained as rest, but those who saw him knew otherwise. Something in his posture had changed. The man who would one day be king now carried the ghost of a letter never meant for his eyes. As William retreated from public duties for 3 days, the palace scrambled to contain what came next: the media's discovery of the photograph's metadata. A sharp-eyed journalist noticed something strange in the photograph files: the timestamps. These weren't taken during the Queen's later years, they spanned over a decade. The mentorship of Catherine had begun long before the public knew her. Which begs the question, did Elizabeth orchestrate Catherine's entrance into the royal family from the very beginning? What was first assumed to be a concentrated mentorship in the twilight of Elizabeth's reign now appears to be something far more profound and far more calculated. Metadata embedded in the original image files revealed a chilling truth. The earliest photographs dated back to nearly 14 months before William and Catherine's official introduction at St. Andrews was ever made public. One image in particular, captured in a modest chamber deep within Windsor, was dated nearly 2 years before their relationship became common knowledge. It showed Catherine, younger, less polished, but already seated across from Elizabeth in the unmistakable posture of briefing. The implications were immediate and explosive. The Queen's connection to Catherine didn't begin after she became a Windsor, it began before she was even seen as a contender. The revelations didn't stop there. When cross-referenced with Elizabeth's undisclosed solo travel logs, movements never released to the public, but recently unsealed under pressure, analysts found a pattern. Several of the Queen's seemingly personal journeys overlapped with the locations and dates of these private photographs. From Balmoral to Sandringham, each quiet trip matched a moment where Catherine appeared alone, briefed, or seated with a notepad. These weren't accidental encounters. These were scheduled sessions. And as one security insider stated, you don't place a civilian inside the Queen's private chambers without clearance. And you certainly don't do it twice. The metadata also exposed a series of location tags that raised immediate alarm: Project Clarion, Subvault 3. Long considered royal folklore, Project Clarion had been whispered about in intelligence-adjacent circles as an operational framework used during periods of succession fragility. Subvault 3 specifically was believed to house alternate scenarios, off-record designs for stabilizing the monarchy during political fracture. Now, with those words encoded in Catherine's files, experts began asking the unthinkable. Was Catherine's emergence as royal bride a carefully executed maneuver inside a long-running continuity plan? Adding to the intrigue was the fact that one of Camilla's first major public appearances alongside Charles in early 2005 aligned exactly with the abrupt cancellation of what had been a long-standing private engagement between Elizabeth and Catherine. It was the only confirmed instance of their meeting being scrapped, and it happened on the same day Camilla was announced as future consort. Some now believe that moment marked a pivot in the Queen's tactical approach, retreating from visibility but never from intention. The mentorship, they argue, simply moved deeper underground. And then there's the Duke of Kent himself. His timing, his methodical release, the framing of each revelation, it didn't appear random. It aligned with other institutional shake-ups within the Commonwealth, the resignation of certain senior advisors, and a notable redistribution of ceremonial duties away from Camilla. Many now believe his release was not just historic preservation, it was an act of revelation. The undoing of the official timeline, the destruction of the myth that Catherine arrived by romance alone. Experts have begun publicly stating what many within the inner circle have whispered for years: Catherine's marriage was not merely a union, it was the insertion of a keystone. The monarchy, fragile in its modern era, had selected its guardian long before the tabloids caught on. And Elizabeth, in her quiet genius, had built a pathway of trust, instruction, and succession that bypassed tradition and rewrote continuity through a single woman's ascension, coded, timed, and hidden in plain sight. As the monarchy reels from revelation after revelation, the public's eyes turn to the woman at the center of it all, not just as a duchess, not just as a consort, but as the quiet queen the crown may have always intended. She was never crowned, but she was chosen, not with ceremony but with whispered counsel, hidden documents, and a legacy passed hand to hand. Catherine's rise was never simply about grace or duty, it was Elizabeth's final masterpiece. And now, as the palace grapples with the truth, one reality becomes undeniable. The monarchy's future was never left to chance. It was trained, it was tested, and it was Catherine. As the weight of the documentary evidence spread across the public sphere, perception shifted with startling speed. What had once been labelled as quiet compliance was suddenly reinterpreted as measured restraint. What critics once dismissed as softness was now understood as strategic patience. Catherine's silence was no longer seen as hesitation, it was seen as preparation. Each photograph, each timestamp, each encoded phrase peeled away the illusion that her rise had been accidental. The public began to recognize a pattern that had been hiding in plain sight for more than a decade. This wasn't adaptation after marriage, this was formation before destiny. And with that realization, a violent recalibration of loyalty, admiration, and expectation. Inside the palace, the tremors were even stronger. William, carrying the private burden of Elizabeth's final letter, is said to have initiated discreet, separate discussions with members of the High Council, meetings unrecorded, unannounced, and profoundly symbolic. Those sessions were not about titles or ceremonies, they were about continuity, about what happens when inherited authority no longer shields the crown from modern fracture. And at the center of those discussions was not his own future alone, but Catherine's role within the architecture his grandmother had built in silence. The line between consort and sovereign guardian had never been thinner. Beyond the gates, the numbers told their own story. Approval ratings for Catherine surged to heights unseen since the early years of Elizabeth's reign. The public, once divided by tradition and skepticism, began to rally around a figure who embodied stability without spectacle. Interviews, commentary, and public polls reflected a growing belief that Catherine represented not just the next generation, but the one deliberately shaped to carry the heaviest weight. She did not rise through force, she rose through trust, and trust once earned does not fade easily. Against this swelling tide, absences became deafening. Camilla's repeated non-appearance at key royal functions, once dismissed as scheduling conflicts, now sparked relentless questioning. Each absence felt less like coincidence and more like omission. The silence around her was thick with speculation. Had she been sidelined? Or had Elizabeth's long strategy already rendered her symbolically obsolete? No official answers came, only more stillness. And in that stillness the narrative hardened. Then came the final confirmation from within the family itself. In a private gathering shielded from press and protocol, Catherine reportedly received the personal blessing of Princess Anne. No cameras, no announcements. Just a moment between two women who understand the unspoken weight of duty. To those who know Anne's unwavering loyalty to the institution above all else, her quiet endorsement spoke louder than any public decree. It was the final seal upon a journey long hidden from view. And so, as one queen fades into the shadows of history, another rises not by name but by design. And the crown, it seems, had always known where it would fall. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.